People usually consume the story of Hades and Persephone as a love story. Personally, I never bought that. To me, the real power of this myth is something far more compelling. The story of a woman who transforms through darkness and survives. When you follow the original sources, this marriage starts to look less like a romance and more like a cold, institutional arrangement. You're playing in a field of flowers, and suddenly, you're taken to the underworld. And when you actually live with this man, he's not a devoted lover. He didn't bring you there because he was overflowing with love. He needed a queen. He's quiet. He shows no emotion. He works all day, and you're trapped underground where no sunlight ever reaches. You grew up beside your mother, surrounded by blooming things, and now this. That's where our reading of Persephone's story begins today. But this isn't the typical Hades and Persephone love story you've seen everywhere. And it's not another debate about whether the abduction was love or force. That angle has been done to death. What we're talking about today is what happened after the abduction. How Persephone dealt with Hades' former lover Minthe. How a dispute over a beautiful young man named Adonis unfolded. How one woman changed, step by step, in the dark. How a girl once called Kore, a daughter of the earth and the light, became something else entirely. How she became Persephone, the queen of the underworld in her own right, and why that transformation might be the most powerful character arc in all of mythology. Persephone carries two names, and they couldn't feel more different from each other. One of those names is Kore. In Greek, Kore simply means girl or daughter. There's no hidden power in that name, no darkness, just that. She was born as Demeter's daughter. She lived as Demeter's daughter, and she was known as Demeter's daughter. That's who she was before everything changed. Persephone, on the other hand, is the name used, even in the Homeric hymn to Demeter from the beginning. Kore isn't really her personal name so much as an epithet, a way of describing her as a girl, as someone's child. As for the name Persephone itself, there are several theories about its origin, and some of them connected to death and destruction. What I find interesting is the contrast between these two names. Kore, a daughter, Persephone, a queen of the dead. To me, that shift in names reflects the arc of her transformation. It's one of the most quietly powerful symbols in the entire myth. So, throughout this video, when you hear Kore, that's her before the abduction, while she was still in the light. When you hear Persephone, that's who she became after, in the dark, on her own. Same person, completely different being. Keep that distinction in mind. Now let's take a closer look at Hades. Greek mythology is full of gods, but Hades holds a uniquely strange position among them. He's not one of the 12 Olympians. He doesn't show up at the parties, while other gods are gathered together, drinking and arguing and causing chaos. Hades is down below, ruling the world of the dead. The Encyclopedia Britannica describes him this way: unmoved by prayer or sacrifice, as pitiless as death itself. Ancient Greeks were so wary of speaking his name that they avoided it entirely. Afraid that saying it might draw his attention, they used other titles and nicknames instead. And there's something structurally important to understand about how mythology tends to work. In the major surviving sources, it's actually quite rare for a male god to be driven by obsession or jealousy over a wife. Zeus doesn't have myths about being jealous of Hera. Poseidon doesn't spiral into possessiveness over Amphitrite. The structure of these myths, generally, places male gods in the role of authority, while goddesses react. So in the primary ancient sources, Hades is not the emotionally intense, obsessive, romantic that modern adaptations have made him into. That version of him is largely a contemporary invention. In the original sources, Hades comes across as cold, strict, and quiet. That's really what he is. So why did he take her? Hades wanted Kore. That part is true, but the nature of that wanting looks very different from a modern love story. When you factor in the tradition around Minthe, whom we'll get to shortly, reading this marriage, purely as a personal love story, becomes harder to sustain. Personally, I read this union less as a romance, and more as something that happened within the logic of divine order and the distribution of power. To understand this, you have to understand why Hades needed a queen at all. In Greek mythology, the cosmos is divided into three domains. Zeus rules the sky, Poseidon rules the sea, and Hades rules the underworld. And here's what stands out to me. The sky has Hera, the sea has Amphitrite, but the underworld had no corresponding queen. From a mythological standpoint, that absence makes the structure of the underworld read as incomplete. This isn't just a matter of Hades being single. If the ruler of death and the dead has no queen beside him, the cosmic order itself comes across as unfinished. In my reading, this made Hades' marriage less of a personal matter and more of a structural necessity for Zeus. And the queen of the underworld couldn't just be anyone. The role required the right symbolic lineage. From that perspective, Kore fits almost perfectly. She's the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the living earth above. The daughter of life becomes the queen of death below. Mythologically, it's a near-perfect pairing. Zeus knew Hades wanted Kore. Rather than mediating openly, he allowed the abduction to happen without telling Demeter. Why? Because he knew she would never agree. So what took place wasn't a crime of passion, at least in terms of what the sources actually tell us. This was a forced union, carried out with Zeus's silent approval. Hades wanted her, Zeus permitted it. Kore and Demeter knew nothing, the day Kore was taken. According to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Kore was out gathering flowers with the nymphs, Narcissus, Hyacinth, roses, violets. Then the earth split open. Hades appeared in a golden chariot and seized her. Kore cried out. She called for her father, Zeus, and Zeus did not answer, because he already knew. The only ones who heard her were Hecate and Helios. Later, the sun god Helios told Demeter where her daughter had gone, and said simply, "Your daughter is now queen of the underworld." Hades had Zeus's permission. What happened to Demeter when she heard that? The goddess of the earth abandoned the earth. Nothing grew. Humans began to starve. Offerings stopped reaching the gods. Only then did Zeus act. Kore, alone in the underworld. Now step into Kore's perspective. She had never once lived in the dark. She was the daughter of Demeter, which means she grew up watching things bloom, running in sunlight, surrounded by living things. And now she'd been taken somewhere with none of that. All around her are the dead, nothing alive. Her husband is consumed by the work of ruling the underworld all day. He doesn't talk much. He doesn't show emotion. It's as if she was brought here because she was needed, given the title of queen. And that's supposed to be enough. Kore refused to eat the food of the underworld, and the moment she eventually ate, the pomegranate seeds becomes the pivotal event that prevents her full return. It reads like a signal that she was still resisting, still, refusing to be absorbed completely into the underworld's order. But then Ovid takes the myth somewhere slightly different. In his version, the moment she eats, the pomegranate is rewritten to feel more deliberate, more voluntary, than it does in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Interpretations vary. Some read it as hunger, some read it as resignation, others see it as something closer to a choice made within impossible conditions. Maybe she understood that nothing fundamental had changed. Zeus had already conspired against her. Her mother would search for her, but no one could undo the god's decision. So perhaps surviving in this world was the only thing left to choose. Even the number of seeds she ate varies across versions. Some say 3, some say 4, some say 7. Each number corresponds to how long she must remain in the underworld each year. Later traditions read this story as an explanation for the seasons. In the popular understanding, Persephone's absence brings winter, and her return brings spring, though some scholars connect the agricultural cycle differently. Either way, the myth at its heart is a story shaped by a mother's grief. But think about what this means for Kore. She doesn't get her freedom back completely. She goes up to the living world every spring and returns to the underworld every fall. That cycle either breaks a person completely or forges them into something unbreakable. The myth chose the latter. Every time Kore went back down, she came back a little more Persephone. After the pomegranate, the figure in the story stops reading simply as Kore. She starts showing more and more of the queen she is becoming, and no moment makes that clearer than the story of Minthe. Minthe is described in tradition as a naiad, a water nymph, and is referred to as Hades' lover. The geographer Strabo records her as his mistress or companion. So why didn't Hades simply marry Minthe? Why did he bring Kore down instead? Here's where the myth reveals one of its crueler structural realities. Nymphs are divine beings, but they don't hold the same rank as the major Olympian gods. In Greek myth, divine marriages aren't simply about personal feeling. They're about cosmic order. The king of the sky has Hera. The king of the sea has Amphitrite. The king of the underworld needs someone of corresponding weight. A nymph doesn't fit that role, not because she lacks love, but because the structure doesn't allow it. Read through that lens, Minthe was in an impossible position from the very beginning. Maybe Hades genuinely cared for her. Maybe it was simply a comfortable arrangement. Either way, the moment Kor arrived, Minthe's place was erased by the structure itself, not because of love, because of cosmic order. And from Minthe's perspective, that has to sting. Not because she did anything wrong, not because she wasn't enough, but simply because of what she was. And what did Minthe do with that? This is the part that's almost jaw-dropping. According to Appian's account, Minthe said it openly, without shame. I am more beautiful than Persephone, more worthy. Hades will come back to me, and Persephone will be driven from this underworld. In modern terms, who do you think you are? He'll come back to me. You don't belong here. Think about how that moment must have felt for Persephone. She was taken from her mother's side while picking flowers, dragged into a sunless world with no friends, no family, no warmth. And now, on top of all that, there's a former lover who's openly trying to push her out. Honestly, if anyone came out of that without changing, that would be the real surprise. What Persephone did next was crush Minthe underfoot and turn her into a mint plant. In some versions attributed to Appian, it's actually Demeter who does the crushing out of rage. Ovid mentions briefly that Persephone transformed a rival into sweet-smelling mint. Depending on the version, the actor changes, but the outcome doesn't. Minthe is gone, and mint takes her place. And there's something quietly striking about that. Mint is a plant that releases more fragrance the harder it's crushed. Minthe didn't disappear. She was transformed, and mint was sometimes associated with death and funeral rites in the ancient world. Becoming that plant meant being absorbed entirely into Hades' world, permanently. Strabo also notes that there was a sanctuary of Hades near a mountain associated with Minthe. The real cruelty of this story is right there. Even in death, Minthe remains beside Hades, just in a completely different form. Here's why this scene matters so much. Think about what Kor would have done in that same moment. She probably would have cried. She might have looked for her mother. She would have endured it, or run from it. That's the response of someone who has only ever known peace and light. But Persephone didn't do any of that. She crushed Minthe. She transformed her. To me, this is the moment Persephone publicly exercises power for the first time. A woman who was treated as a victim uses that power for herself. And in the major surviving sources, there's very little detail about how Hades responded to any of this. Whether he intervened, whether he was angry, whether he tried to stop it. The record doesn't say. Persephone handled it, and it was done. The sources don't show Hades stepping in to protect her or offering any kind of emotional support in that moment. In this unfamiliar world, Persephone had to carve out her own place on her own. And in watching her do that, we stop seeing Kore's innocence and start seeing the cold clarity of a queen. After Minthe, Persephone only grows stronger. And when she returns to the world above, she begins making herself known in an entirely different way. That's where Adonis enters the story. According to Apollodorus in the library, Aphrodite placed the infant Adonis in a chest and entrusted him to Persephone, wanting to keep the beautiful child hidden from the world. But when Persephone opened the chest, she refused to give him back. As Adonis grew into a young man, Aphrodite came to reclaim him, and Persephone said no. This moment can be read as desire, or it can be read as a queen, asserting her right over someone she raised and protected. In my reading, Persephone here looks less like a woman in love, and more like someone claiming authority over what she nurtured. I raised him. I kept him safe. He's mine. That logic escalated into a full-scale dispute among the gods, and Zeus was called in to mediate. According to Apollodorus, Zeus divided Adonis's year into thirds, one portion for Persephone, one for Aphrodite, and one left to Adonis himself. But Adonis chose to spend his own free time with Aphrodite as well. In the end, Persephone didn't fully win, even with Zeus presiding, and that loss only made her harder. The circumstances of Adonis's death also vary across versions. He was killed by a boar. That part stays consistent. But who sent the boar? Some say Ares, some say Artemis. A few later interpretations have even imagined that Persephone herself had a hand in what happened, choosing destruction over loss. Whether or not that reading holds up, What matters is that people came to see her that way. She was no longer a victim. She had become something to be reckoned with. Who was really in charge of the underworld? Persephone's power surfaces again and again across the myths. When Orpheus descended to retrieve his dead wife, Eurydice, his music was so extraordinary that everything in the underworld went still. Sisyphus stopped pushing his boulder. Tantalus had a brief rest from his torment. In Ovid and other versions, Persephone is described as being genuinely moved by his song. That moment shows her functioning not just as a queen in title, but as a real co-ruler of the dead. Then there's Sisyphus. He arrived in the underworld and approached Persephone with a story that his funeral rites hadn't been properly observed, and he needed to return briefly to the living world to sort things out. In some accounts, Persephone was persuaded and allowed him to go back. Of course, Sisyphus ran and never returned on his own, and he was eventually caught and condemned to roll his boulder for eternity. The story makes it look like she was deceived, but it also shows that Persephone was understood to have real authority over the rules and exceptions of the underworld. And then there's the story of Theseus and Pirithous. The two heroes descended to the underworld with the actual goal of abducting Persephone. Hades received them as guests and invited them to sit down. The moment they did, they found themselves fixed to their seats and unable to rise. Theseus was eventually rescued by Heracles, but Pirithous stayed there forever. That was the price of laying a hand on Persephone. Why has this myth been rewritten for thousands of years? Ovid retold this myth while subtly shifting the tone of certain scenes. The pomegranate moment, for instance, reads with more ambiguity in his hands than in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, leaving more room for the sense that Persephone chose. Scholars have offered different explanations for this, citing Roman cultural sensibilities, Ovid's own tendency to reshape his source material. Some argue he was nudging Persephone toward a more self-determining figure. That interpretation is still being debated. On one side, the argument goes that giving Persephone a choice in how her story is retold is really about projecting the world modern readers want to live in onto an ancient myth. It's the desire to say the victim actually chose it. On the other side, there's the argument that erasing the violence from the original is the same as erasing what the original was. Turning abduction into romance is, at its core, making something brutal look beautiful. Both readings are serious, and both are still alive in the conversation. And the reason this debate hasn't died is exactly what makes this myth matter. The abduction happened. So did everything that followed. What changes is how you read it.
Put all of it together, and one image comes into focus. Kore was pure. She loved flowers. She grew up at her mother's side. She had no experience of the world's darker edges. Then she was taken somewhere she never asked to go, forced to live beside a husband who barely acknowledged her, left to face a rival on her own, and made to fight for what was hers in the court of the gods. Nobody protected her. Nobody stepped in. She was alone. Does that count as darkening, or does it count as growth? We call it darkening because we use Kore as the baseline. Bright, innocent, safe at her mother's side. But that version of her existed in a world where she had no choices. After the abduction, Persephone had choices. Whether to eat or refuse. Whether to endure or push back. Whether to give or hold on. The accumulation of those choices is what made her Persephone. Hades took Kore, and the major ancient sources have very little to say about warmth or closeness developing between them after that. Ironically, it may be exactly that absence that made Persephone who she became. In my reading, that empty space is what forced Kore to build herself into a queen on her own. Only those who have survived something in the dark really understand this. Whether it was forced on you or you walked into it, what matters more is who you became on the other side. Kore was in the flower field. Persephone became a queen. Both were the same person. That's why this story still speaks to us, because we all start as Kore. There's a time when we know nothing, when darkness is abstract, when all we're doing is picking flowers, and then one day, without warning, the ground splits open. You get pulled into the dark before you're ready. What you do in that moment is what separates Kore from Persephone. Crying and calling out for someone is a valid response. Feeling the injustice of it all is valid. But there has to be something that comes after. Not breaking in front of Minthe, facing the next loss after Adonis, staying open enough to be moved by Orpheus' song, learning from being deceived by Sisyphus and carrying that forward. Persephone was forged in the underworld, In the flower field, she was Kore. In the dark, she became Persephone. Spring isn't made by peace and comfort. It's made by whoever survived the winter. That's why so many people across so many generations have read this myth as the story of the seasons turning. Whatever darkness you're in right now, it might be the process of you becoming Persephone. This was never just a love story. It's the story of a woman who survived the dark alone. And now you know why it still matters. When someone throws you into the dark, don't fall apart. Persephone turned that darkness into a throne. So can you?